Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich begrüße Sie sehr herzlich zu unserem heutigen Vortrag. Und es ist mir eine besondere Freude, Carter Foster zu begrüßen. Carter, a very warm welcome from me. I'm very proud that you came. Carter Foster from Whitney Museum in New York, der ein großer Experte des Werks von Ellsworth Kelly ist, mit dem ihn eine tiefe, enge Freundschaft verbindet. Und ich war daher sehr froh, als Carter unsere Einladung annahm, zunächst einen Beitrag für den Katalog zu schreiben und dann eben auch diesen Vortrag heute hier zu halten. Und zwar einen Vortrag, der noch einmal das Werk von Ellsworth Kelly aufgreifen wird, ihn erläutern wird, dann aber auf eine ganz besondere Arbeit eingehen wird, den Entwurf für die Architektur und die Ausgestaltung einer Kapelle, die Kelly Mitte der 80er Jahre gemacht hat. Ein Projekt, für das er, wie gesagt, die Architektur, aber dann auch die farbigen Glasfenster und einen Kreuzweg entworfen hat, eine Bildserie aus 14 Bildern plus eine Skulptur, die eben in diese Kapelle eingesetzt werden sollten. Es war ein Projekt, was schon also im konzeptionellen Stadium sehr weit gediehen war und dann aber nicht zustande kam. Und Carter Foster wird uns darüber berichten, was es mit diesem Projekt dann auf sich hatte, warum und weshalb es nicht zustande gekommen ist. Ein paar Worte zu Carter Foster. Er ist, wie gesagt, am Whitney Museum for American Art in New York, dort der leitende Kurator für die Abteilung der Zeichnungen und Grafiken. Carter stammt aus Atlanta, Georgia und hat an der University of Georgia seinen Bachelor gemacht und dann anschließend seinen Master Degree an der Brown University. Er war beschäftigt an der New York Public Library, am Philadelphia Museum, dann am Cleveland Museum in Cleveland Museum of Art, bevor er im Jahre 2004 als Kurator für Prints und Drawings zum LA County Museum wechselte und ein Jahr später dann an die neu geschaffene Position des Leiters der Sammlung für Grafik und Zeichnung am Whitney Museum tätig ist und dort eine ganze Reihe von wichtigen Ausstellungen zu Themen der zeitgenössischen und modernen Kunst gemacht hat, mit sehr vielen Publikationen. Außer Ellsworth Kelly ist er ein großer Spezialist, was beim Whitney Museum natürlich nahe liegt, für das Werk von Edward Hopper, über den er gerade arbeitet und eine große retrospektive Ausstellung seiner Zeichnungen vorbereitet. Meine Damen und Herren, Carter, again, thanks for coming, and we are all looking forward to hearing your lecture. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Guten Abend. Thank you for listening in English. I will try to speak slowly. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Thank you, Ulrich, for inviting me. Thanks to the Haus Kunst and its director, Okwien Wieser, for having me, and to Andreas Saul for all her help. So I am going to speak tonight on a project somewhat unusual in Ellsworth Kelly's body of work. It's a chapel that he designed, I think Ulrich explained, with a traditional Stations of the Cross around it and in the interior. And it's really the only example that I know of a sort of whole holistic approach to an environment that Ellsworth Kelly has done in his career. It was never realized. So I'm really talking about a work of art that doesn't exist, as Ellsworth himself reminded me, which I thought was interesting. And I just show it in the context of a few things in the exhibition, and also one of Ellsworth Kelly's plants drawing. You have two early works, Atlantic, which is in the Whitney's collection, the painting, a plant drawing, and then the very seminal work, Window, Museum of Modern Art, Paris, from the early 1950s, and then the drawing that Ellsworth Kelly made for the Stations of the Cross. So you see this distribution of 14 elements, compositions that look sort of almost like flags or semaphores across this sheet, which is really the only record we have besides one other sheet and the chapel design itself, which we'll see. We can see it here. That exist of this project. So you can see that he designed a fairly modern, simple interior space that's a traditional Greek cross plan. I think you can see that there's, you have the apse area here. So if it was oriented in a traditional way that a chapel or church would be, this would be the eastern part, this would be western, this would be the southern transept, and the northern transept. And then you can see that he thought of having these panels created, 14 Stations of the Cross, that would be distributed around the interior. It was actually commissioned in the mid-1980s by a man named Douglas Kramer, a well-known collector of modern art and a patron of Ellsworth Kelly's, who had a property in Santa Barbara in California. So it would have been a very light-filled area of the world, so in that sense very appropriate for a chapel with stained glass. And it was to be built, it was brought to a fairly high degree of resolution, and of course it didn't get realized because of money. Why else? And not enough money. So if anybody wants to sponsor this project, I'm sure Kelly himself, Ellsworth himself said to me, maybe after you write about this, somebody will actually want to do it now. He had architects draw up plans. It was to be done in concrete, so fairly simple. And I think if you know the work of someone like Tadeo Ando, you can imagine what the kind of thin concrete walls that it would have. An architect who's also done a religious architecture. It also makes me, in an interesting way, think of the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, which has these beautiful barrel vaults that let in a suffused kind of daylight, which I think the interior spaces of this maybe resemble a bit. Here's another view of the inside of this. You can see that it has one of Ellsworth's wooden sculptures at the very end. So this is as if we were entering the chapel from the western doorway, looking towards the apse end, and you see this very simple wooden element that's meant to certainly evoke a cross, as in traditional Christian chapel. I should say too that Kelly is not a religious man. He's not necessarily he doesn't believe in God. He considers himself an atheist, but he's extremely influenced by religious art and architecture, and has been his entire life. He's an artist who's deeply involved in art of the past. He understands art history extremely well, which I think we'll see as I proceed with this talk. And I think what's very interesting about this project is that it's really an abstract distillation of a Christian chapel, a very traditional Christian chapel, with many elements of traditional Christian art and architecture very well understood by the artist, but which makes no reference to those things anywhere in it except in the number of the stations and the kind of format of the building. So if you are a Christian, you could walk into this chapel and understand immediately what's going on. You'd feel very comfortable, but it also works very much as a piece of modernist art and architecture with few references to the past in that sense. The cross itself is not an actual cross. It's just a vertical piece of wood, but of course it evokes a cross. And then the way things are distributed within, and particularly the way the light and the stained glass work, I think would make anyone who's wants to have a spiritual experience would feel very at home in an environment like this. And I think it's also important to state that Kelly himself has said that spirituality is something that he very much wants to get across in his art, and that abstract art can very much address. And there's, of course, a tradition of abstract art addressing spirituality in the 20th century, and which this chapel falls firmly within that tradition, I think we could say. So this is the sheet that exists in the artist collection still that shows the designs for these stations. He planned to have them executed in, if the project were to be realized, he conceived them in white marble and slate, so that they would have had a very strong material quality, a very permanent quality in these materials. They wouldn't have been paintings. He's said more recently that he thinks that if he did the project now, he could do them in panel paintings, the likes of which you see in the exhibition here. But I think that his initial interest in doing them in this kind of permanent stone material also makes an interesting comparison to ecclesiastical architecture of the past. And then we can ask ourselves, in looking at this project, what does it mean for an artist who's known for rigorous practitioner of abstraction to do something traditional like a Stations of the Cross? And we can look at the art of the past to sort of gain some insight in the understanding of this tradition and the way what Kelly really does with a lot of his work is a distillation of the world as he sees it. As I said, he's deeply interested in the art of the past, and I think so I compare a couple of the stations here, and on this one here is actually the crucifixion part of the stations. This here is the veil of Veronica, or the when Veronica wipes his face, and it's interesting. I show Mantegna's crucifixion here. Because geometry certainly plays a role in many of these works and the way they tell stories. And I think it's, when you have abstract art and this interest in the shift from a Renaissance window on the world view of painting to the interest in surface flatness, which kind of becomes one of the main tropes of modernist painting in the 20th century, and one of the major shifts in art history. It's quite interesting, but you can still, I think, understand that stories are to be told in a rigorous abstract language, and I think that the relationship between the text and specific stations and the way the artist has chosen to render these becomes quite interesting. I think it's also, one of the things that the artist really picked up on when he decided to do this project is the fact that the cross itself in this series is really a protagonist in the story of the Stations of the Cross. And I'll get more into that in a bit, but I think you can see that here. I show, oh, excuse me. This is a painting by Bernardo Strozzi, Veil of Veronica. I was struck by how the diagonal becomes an important compositional element in that. And then often in these traditional Stations of the Cross, in the moment where Veronica wipes Christ's face, the cross itself is often at a diagonal to the picture plane, which is something that Kelly picks up on in his version of the Stations. And then just to show you another very famous depiction of the descent from the cross, and of course many of the Passion of Christ, the Stations of the Cross, many of the individual, it's part of this very set standard of set series of images in Christian iconography, but many of the individual scenes are, of course, have traditions of their own, long traditions in the history of art, the descent from the cross being one of them. And because often the simple horizontal line of the cross and also the horizontality of Christ's body is often evoked in the descent from the cross, I wanted to compare that with the Kelly version in this chapel. I also thought I would just mention a bit about Kelly's art, give you a little bit of an overview quickly. The exhibition here, which is so beautifully installed and it goes so well with the architecture of the building, it's really a wonderful survey of Kelly's art from the very beginnings. He starts to become mature as an artist in the late 1940s and early 1950s when he's studying in France. And then once he discovers sort of how he's going to work as an artist, what motivates him, what the kinds of motifs and the approaches to art making that get him going, he pretty much sticks with those for much of the rest of his career. So this crucial early formation time in France is really significant. And I show you one of his best-known works from this period is called Colors for a Large Wall from 1951, which is this checkerboard composition to the upper left. And it's important for a number of reasons. You have to remember that this is a time when, in America at least, abstract expressionism, this kind of heroic, dynamic art form, popularized by Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, was really what was in everyone's mind. And so this is a fairly radical work at the time. It's a work that uses chance compositional methods in terms of the distribution of the squares. Each square is an individual panel of paint. So there's a kind of non-hierarchy of the composition, which is something that Kelly was important in innovating. There's always a found element to Kelly's work, or often there is, in terms of, and in this case, the colors themselves were found colors that were popular gummed commercial papers that you could buy in France that school children often played with. And he developed a collage using these chance techniques to develop a composition like this, and then blows it up to a larger scale. It's called Color for a Large Wall, and that's significant, the fact that he uses wall in the title, because one of the main things about Kelly's art that's significant, I think, and you see it beautifully here in this exhibition, is the fact that the architecture and the space around it becomes activated by his work, so that the figure-ground relationship is no longer something that's important, even though they're paintings, and so the figure-ground relationship in a way becomes effaced or complicated, and so that the architecture or the wall itself becomes the ground, and it activates the space around it. And in that sense, a lot of his work is like sculpture and has a kind of sculptural quality in that it exists in space and also as an object. I think that in a later work like Red, Green, Blue, Kelly's often described as a master of edge, and edge is something, and line is something that is crucial to the way you perceive his work, and something he's a master of, and really, he's an artist who rewards a great subtlety of looking. And I think that you see that very much in something like Red, Green, Blue from 1963, where the positive, negative space, figure ground, all of that, to say which is which becomes quite subjective. What you can say is that the painting itself, the object that the painting is the single thing that becomes the ground in the architecture. And this becomes significant to think about as when we talk about the Stations of the Cross. And then he's also well known for being a sort of master of the shaped canvas, and as I said, so you see two fairly recent examples in blue, Blue Curve from 2009 and Lake from 2002. I think because Kelly's so famous for his color, and so that's one of the reasons that this show is so interesting, because it really distills his career into this single element of black and this duality of black and white that is a great distillation of his practice over many decades. But he's famous as a colorist and for the way he uses color. But I think people don't realize that how much his imagery, if you can call it that, is generated. In fact, all of it's generated by observation in the real world, and in that sense, he's dealing with found imagery in a sense. And so something like Blue Curves or Lake, the lake in particular really evokes a landscape, and he's using the far shore and the edge of the picture plane as compositional givens with this swath of blue to come up with this what looks like an irregular, and it is an irregular rectangular shape, but it comes directly from nature and his observation of nature. And almost all of his work is generated by this very, very close observation in the real world. And this was a breakthrough that he made early in his career. And I wanted to compare him to Cézanne, as you see here, and Ingres up here, even though it may not seem like the most obvious comparison, just to say that with Cézanne, it's important to understand his art in this trajectory of modern painting that begins in the late 19th century in France. He's deeply influenced by French culture and his looking at French art. And then there's often a sensuality and an evocation of the human figure in his work. And someone like Ingres is also very attuned to edges, the way edges meet, the tension between edges and background, in much the same way that Kelly's paintings dynamize the space that they're in. And I think also you can see the sort of anthropomorphic body part quality in a work like Blue Curves. So this piece that's in the exhibition called Window, Museum of Modern Art, was a seminal work for Kelly because it represents this idea of transfer and the idea of the index, which becomes important and helps generate his work. He basically realized that the world, and he puts this in sort of these terms when he talks about it, that the world was full of shapes, so why did he need to invent more? He could, there's by looking carefully at the world around him, he didn't need to invent any new compositions. He could take what was there. And so a lot of many of his paintings are decontextualized things that we could never recognize their sources, but which there are often sources for, and when you see them, it becomes quite obvious. But when you can have something that's so radically distilled and abstract and simplified that you can't imagine there would be a source in the real world, but in fact there is. And this Window Museum of Modern Art, which is in the exhibition, beautifully illustrates this. And in fact, when he first showed this work, he didn't want to reveal the source, and he didn't reveal the source. It's only later art history where we've come to understand where this came from. So what he did was he made two panels, one for the top part of the window and one for the bottom part. The bottom part is essentially the stretches of the canvas, and the canvas has been reversed. So you have him turning the tools of painting in the simplest way possible: white paint, almost like primer in the top, and then the stretcher bars in the back of the canvas, and inverting them so that you have a singular object that comes from a source in the real world. Has strong metaphorical connotations, since windows, painting has been seen as a window on the world since the Renaissance. And so turning that back on itself and making painting into an object was a really significant move. So this was an example of him taking something that existed in the real world, adjusting it in very, very subtle, specific ways and very careful ways, so that the subtleties of observation that you need to bring on the piece become what's important about it. And then that freed the artist up to a great degree. And he continued along this path and sort of developed this process in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So this is an example of how the indexical mark becomes important for him. Now, the index is a term that comes from semiotics, and it basically means an image that has, or a sign or symbol that has a physical connection to the thing that makes it. So a fingerprint is an example of an index, or a shadow, as you see here. A photograph is also an example of an indexical type of mark. And this becomes significant because he realizes he can take these things from the world and shift the scale and the color sometimes, but it remains firmly rooted in what he saw. And you see this beautifully in this photograph, which is in the exhibition. And there's a version of this painting. This is called La Combe. He did 3 versions of this work, I believe, all taken from this series of steps. And he simply noticed the shadows on the steps as an interesting sort of semi-pattern. La Combe is actually a place where he was staying in France at the time that he was inspired to do this work. And then he realized he could just take each step as a kind of separate dividing aspect of the composition and translate, transmute, transport, change the scale, shift, change the color, each one of these things, but remain exact to what he was seeing. And this, the photograph here doesn't correspond exactly to the lines in the painting, but in fact, it does correspond to what he was using when he made the painting. But then, of course, by changing it from a vertically oriented composition to something horizontal, by flattening it out completely so that everything's on the same plane, it completely changes the nature of the marks, and he does decontextualize and thus make abstract these marks, and they have their own sort of internal beauty and unity. But it's just important to know that coming from the real world is crucial for the artist, because he uses his eyes to see it so carefully. And then something else that's interesting to note about the way he works is that he often delves back into his past to create new works. There's a work in this exhibition here called Sen, which is taken from, it's an earlier work was actually remade recently, but that itself came from an earlier work, and it's a reflection of an arch of, I think, the Pont Neuf in Paris in the River Seine, so it's 2 kind of half ovals coming together. And then this painting called Atlantic was derived not long after the drawings themselves were made, but from a series of drawings that he made in a sketchbook that's called Drawings on a Bus. And so I show an example here of these 2 sketchbook pages, and I think you can see that they actually, it was turned into a facsimile a few years ago, and so it reflects the actual way the sketchbook was. And you can see that the gutter itself becomes important. And what he was doing was basically he was on a bus. He had the sketchbook open, and the shadows were being cast on the pages, and he simply delineated the lines that made the shadows and then filled them in. So something very simple like that developed this very restrained, clear, geometric, but also very sensual vocabulary of forms coming from the real world. And he realized this was great source material for him. He could enlarge in the scale, and so when he made the painting, he keeps the proportions, he keeps everything that's in the small scale drawing, but it absolutely changes the way, especially your body relates to the work when you see it in person. And so often he's a very prolific artist. He's someone who is drawing all the time, and he has stacks and stacks of works that he's never, drawings that represent ideas that he's never realized, so he's constantly going back and mining past work to make new paintings, and he continues to do that, and he's especially been doing that in the last few years. And there's actually a couple of drawings in the back section of the exhibition that were done in the 1950s that were only recently turned into paintings. And I say this just because it's interesting for his own relationship to the art historical past and his own past, that it's almost like a circular way of working that he feels very comfortable with. Also, this very careful observation of the real world, as I've been talking about, is just significant. And what's one of the great things about this exhibition is that there's this room of photographs, and I think people don't realize. And he's not known as a photographer, and photography's not really something. I don't think he would consider himself a photographer the way someone like William Eggleston would. But the photographs are so revealing about the way he works, and I just wanted to show this comparison, because this painting bar that's also in the exhibition, and even though it's not a one-to-one correspondence with this wonderful photograph of a barn roof, and you can see that the painting itself was done earlier, I think you can see that the way he culls from the real world. So artists like Ellsworth Kelly, you really realize when you talk to them how much differently they see the world than you do, and there's like a hyper-perception involved with someone like him that's almost astounding, because you realize he simply sees details that you miss. And as much as that, he's able to eliminate things that, and he knows what to eliminate in order to make something interesting. And I think that's really significant in terms of his approach. And then also the decontextualization that happens makes you realize that leaving something out is as important as putting something in. See it very directly in this comparison. Both of these works are in the exhibition, not hanging next to each other. And I think you can see how Black Curve, the painting on the left, and this photograph of a snowy landscape in New York, near where he lives, are related. And it's sort of obvious. I think also the idea of landscape, often his work evokes something as simple as a horizon line, and thus a landscape becomes the most immediate metaphorical projection that we can make on the piece, and I think that's very clear here, and it's something you see throughout his career. And then the figure-ground relationship, often in positive and negative space, both things that are very important for Kelly. There was this exhibition that was here that I believe is closed now, because I tried to see it and it wasn't open, and I was disappointed. Of plant drawings, which was a wonderful complement to the black and white show. Kelly's interesting because this rigorous body of abstract paintings that he's known for is one thing. He draws quite a bit. He makes portrait drawings and figurative drawings in a fairly, I wouldn't say traditional way, but that's one aspect of his practice. But he doesn't have an extremely peripatetic or wide-ranging practice the way some artists do, or a wide range of obviously imagery. He's someone who narrows down, and for whatever reason, early on in his life as an artist, he realized that drawing from plants and drawing from nature and these very, very careful observations of edges that interested him was natural when you drew plants. And so he draws plants entirely with line. And it really, all these pieces really become about the tension of edges between the interior of the form, the positive negative space, the space outside the form, and almost a balance between these things. So in this lemon branch on the left here, this diagonal that sort of divides the paper, figure-ground relationship is fairly strong. I think it's a little less strong in the piece to the right, where the negative space around the plant becomes charged and is almost as interesting and important as the interior space. And indeed, there are some plant drawings where it's hard to recognize what the plant actually is. It's so simplified. And it's interesting to note that these drawings are done without any shading at all, without any excuse me, gradation between light and dark, which is something that you think of usually going along with drawings. They're purely done with line. And again, the figure-ground relationship, this interest in exploiting that is something I think you can see well in this piece here, which this very curious form, which looks like you're looking down on a figure from above, a figure that may have his or her arms like this, so the head and the two arms, but here's something where the positive and negative space really become intertwined in an interesting way. And I think something that's striking about this is to think about the aesthetic of Old Master drawings, so-called Old Master drawings done by post-Renaissance and on through the 19th century. And I'm showing a drawing by Ang, an artist who Kelly admires greatly. And in Old Master drawings, you often, because you see multiple tries of the same part of the body or multiple sketches on one sheet, you end up with an interesting tension between positive and negative space. So you can read the figure of this nude male figure very clearly, as well as the upraised arm. But the charge you get in spaces like this, where you get these abstract spaces created, is something that's part of the aesthetic of drawing that other artists have come to appreciate later on, and which is part of their appeal as objects in general. And I think that's, so in that sense, you can read Kelly in a kind of interesting tradition. And then just to bring it back to religious architecture a bit, because that's one of the things we'll be focusing on, is this earlier work called Vault Flower, which is in which Kelly was inspired to draw the vaults of a Gothic cathedral or chapel or some sort of Gothic architecture. It's not the one I'm showing you. And then you saw with inverting it simply by this simple act of turning it the other way, it could become something else, which is a lot of the way he approaches the paintings that he makes, by distilling, bringing out, transforms one thing into another, and I think you can see that fairly clearly here. Also, I think things like, these shapes here are just such typical Kelly shapes, and you can see him picking those forms out of the world and then distilling them, drawing them out, making them larger or smaller, changing them slightly. They become the kind of objects that he likes to make. And then here's an example of sort of him at work. This is from a tablet where he pasted together a number of notations. Here you have photographs from newspapers. I don't know how well you can see this in this projection, but he's basically picking out geometric shapes from the things people are wearing. And here it's not something in any way that any of us you wouldn't look at this photograph and think, oh, looks like two squares, but this is really where his eye comes into play, and where his kind of reductive eye and the simplification that he feels comfortable with bringing to the world is so important. And you can see how you can jump from this close observation of reality to these very simplified geometric shapes. But in his mind, when he's making a work from something like this, the source is always there in his head. So now we come to this chapel in a little bit more detail. And it's just important to say, so Kelly, he goes to France. He was born in New York. He studied at a school in Boston, an art school, and then he enlists in the army at the end of World War II, and serves time in France while he's in the army, and then he returns to America, but then goes back to France under the GI Bill, which allowed artists to study, and he enrolled in art schools so that he could keep getting money. But mainly he spent time looking at French art and the French landscape. And so in the late 1940s, he spent time traveling around Paris and all over France, in fact. So this chapel that he designed in the mid-1980s is definitely a reflection of these formative years he spent in France. And in this Romanesque church of Notre-Dame-la-Grande in Poitiers is one that he visited in 1948 and took a picture of. This is actually, this date is wrong, it says 1946, but I'm pretty sure he went later. And again, he made a painting early on in his career of the mandorla. He was struck by the geometric simplicity, especially of Romanesque architecture, in which the interior spaces and the exterior expression of those spaces is usually very clear. Also, the simple stone masonry and the fact that you can see the lines between the stones became something that he was very struck by. He described it himself as stone on stone on stone on stone, like this repetition of stone shapes over and over again. And here's an example of him seeing this mandorla shape in the apex of the facade of this church, and then taking that out of a context, although imbuing it with a kind of spirituality in this early painting. And then he did a whole series of iconic-looking paintings that show mother and child figures, definitely with an influence of Picasso, which I think is pretty clear here, but also influenced by Romanesque frescoes that were in particularly this church of Saint-Savin that he visited. He actually visited the church after he did some of these paintings, but he was very aware of the frescoes and the imagery type. And I think that in the restrained palette that you see in the Romanesque painting, and in the kind of interplay of positive-negative space, which comes partly from the fact that they're not in great condition and that they have a monochromatic quality which reduces them down further. This is something he saw as a positive thing. So he did a whole series of these, which gives you an example of what his early style was like, very different from what he did later. And then he also made a series of drawings from Byzantine manuscripts. He studied that there was a library in Paris where he had access to these types of works. And again, you can see they almost look crude in this sense, but he's copying something that itself was a pre-Renaissance type of painting. But you can see his interest in picking out certain shapes, especially I think the wings of this angel are very, very telling for his later work. More examples of these sort of religious icons, which he just did as a kind of exercise throughout the year 1948 and then 1949. And then here you can see him drawing from the interior of Notre Dame in Paris, and where you can really see how this distillation of shapes and forms and flattening out you can see the easy inspiration that he would get from these. So this chapel also, I think it's a reflection of, although Kelly himself was studying more Romanesque architecture when he was in France, they're a reflection of a Byzantine architectural style as much as anything, because in Byzantine architecture, the Greek cross was the standard form, and Greek cross is where you have all the wings of the chapel are of the same length. It's not like a transept, it's not like a Latin cross church. And that's what he's adapting for his own chapel. So here we see that the chapel would have had this half dome here. There was no dome in the center, and then these very simple flat facades on each of the transept arms. We can take a little walk through the chapel. So what happened was with this commission, he made a model. As you can see here, it's a very simple model out of foam core. And he was able to take this series of photographs, which actually gives you a fairly good idea of what it would be like to be in it, although it's a very simple materials. And it's interesting to note that when he made little miniature paintings, he changed some of the compositions, as we'll see in a bit. So this would be the western entrance. So you'd approach it and you'd see this grid of stained glass panels that wouldn't really probably look like much from the outside, but once you walked in, they'd become suffused with light. Once you walk through this door here, you'd see the view here, and you'd see the simple wooden totem sculpture that is not something that would have been possible in Kelly's work if this commission had happened earlier, because he didn't start doing wooden sculpture till later. But it seemed like an easy adaptation for an idea of this type. And you can see how that there's a rhythm set up with the Stations of the Cross, the individual stations, as they're distributed throughout the interior of the building. And there are two groups of three as you enter. So this is the first, second, and third stations, and the last three are over here. And then there's four groups of two on the other transept arms as you move through. And so if you walk in and turned around, this is what you would see in the upper left here. You'd see this grid of suffused light, the stations again, and then as you walk around, here's those southern sort of rose window, I'll call it, because he was inspired by actual rose windows in Gothic cathedrals. With the Stations of Cross, which have an almost kind of musical rhythm as you move through the space. And in that sense, they become, and to use a modern term, very time-based, in that it's a very experiential, kind of holistic approach to moving through the space. that's a full-on view if you were in the other transept arm, looking back to this spectrum wheel of long, elongated rectangular forms that create this sort of circular form in the middle. You can see the cross sculpture here. And then the other window in these tumbling rectangular forms form the other focal point, one of the other focal points of the chapel. You can see that and it'd be interesting if it had actually gotten built, how simple it would have remained. Of course, most chapels have a pulpit or someplace where preaching can occur, and they also usually have benches. This may have been something that you would have been just meant to walk through, I would imagine. It's also fairly small scale, so fairly human in scale. The paintings themselves wouldn't have been all that large. And so then all of the stained glass designs that Kelly came up with for this particular work represent things he'd explored at this point in his career many times in other, or often in other formats. So Color Panels for a Large Wall is a commission of works in a grid format that were produced for the National Gallery of Art in Washington right after the building itself was finished in 1977. As you probably know, it's an IMP building with very large interior spaces. And so by this time in Kelly's career, he was really a master at activating these large interior spaces with these very simple color grids. And it's something he did a number of times, but they're space specific. They're done for a specific spot. And so I think you can see how he was very comfortable with that kind of vocabulary by the time he did his Stations of the Cross Chapel. And then I think more interestingly, too, perhaps this other rose window, I'll call it, represents his exploration of a spectrum motif. So, of course, a color spectrum is a scientific aspect to it. It's the color light breaks down into spectrum colors that can be scientifically measured. But Kelly's approach was not to translate a scientific spectrum at all. He did it very instinctively. And he first started exploring this actually in France with these gummed papers that I mentioned before, where he used the found colors just to give a range of color where one color sort of leads into the other in a kind of a very natural way for him. Often it's light on one end with dark in the middle. So as you see in this work here, you get the lighter yellows and the darker purpley blue colors, and then go back into sort of greens and yellows at the other end. He's explored this a number of times. Again, not when he initially did it, but when he became a more successful artist with more resources, he started doing these spectrums on a larger scale. The piece in the lower slide here is actually a piece that's up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now. They keep it usually on permanent view, and it's great because you can see something about the scale of this work. They're large, so they're larger than human beings, but they do have a relationship to the body, which is something significant. And they're separate panels, and they do go in this spectrum. And so when the Chapel Commission came about, he had the idea to do this kind of rose window, but adopt his spectrum motif, which seemed perfectly suited for stained glass. More interestingly still, I think, is what he did for this the south transept window of his chapel, which picks up on the motif of the north transept window in Chartres Cathedral. So Kelly went to see Chartres Cathedral in, I think, 1954. And he always remembered this. I mean, this is a very famous, obviously Chartres is very famous for its stained glass. But he picked out the geometry that meant something to him when it came time for him to do his own version of religious architecture. And he explained that he noticed that what he liked about the squares that he picked out was the continuously tumbling quality that they seem to have. So basically, they line up. If you draw a line from every fourth one, you get these edges lining up. So there's a very rigorous geometry that's not surprising in any way, but he simply pulled that out, and you get this then very active star-like form where, again, the positive and negative space becomes, it's not clear which is one and which is the other. Obviously there are these square tumbling forms going around in a circle, but I think the interior area between them creates its own kind of geometry that spills out into the area around them and charges the whole composition. So it's both very simple and quite dynamic at the same time. And I think this for me is one of his more interesting compositions that he's ever come up with, and it would be wonderful to see it as a real work someday. So as he was designing this chapel, his main challenge was to figure out textually how to adapt the Stations of the Cross, and he did it in a fairly brilliant way, I think. Of course, there's a very simple symbolism here of light and dark. Black and white become the two main elements that he's working with, but then the black and white, the two positive and negative aspects of those things create a line in the middle of each of the compositions. So he's really dealing with black, white, and a line. And how do you tell a story with that? And of course, he's got a very rigorous structure to work with. The Stations of the Cross have this tradition that really developed. It becomes codified in the Catholic Church in the 17th century and becomes popular as a thing for pilgrims to do in the 17th century. It was around before then, but it was then that the church itself actually prescribed rules for how to gain an indulgence if you follow the Stations of the Cross. And the Stations of the Cross were often adapted. They were adapted to church interiors that existed already, so you'd have the stations placed around in different spots, but in order, so you see them in a succession, but often applied to architecture that existed already. So sometimes they were on pillars. Often they were, though, at the entranceways to chapels that go around the church. And then, of course, there's this textual aspect of them, where you have a description of each major thing that happens to Christ as he's crucified from his condemnation by Pontius Pilate to the entombment of Christ. So basically, from the time he's condemned to death to his burial. And that's what the 14 Stations of the Cross deal with. I'm showing you an example by Gian Domenico Tiepolo that exists in the Church of San Paolo in Venice, Italy, just because it's a really wonderful example. And even though the correspondences with Kelly aren't direct, I think you can see very clearly that the cross itself as an object is the main protagonist as much as Christ is in this story, especially as a device that relegates and determines what the composition will be. I think Kelly's real genius here was to recognize that he could use that as the structuring element of his piece and have it convey a text in a way that was meaningful in a Christian sense even. Because if you're familiar with what the stations are, and of course there's ambiguity, and of course you can read what you want into them, but there's also some very interesting, I think, precedents for what he's doing. So things like, so not that there's an exact correspondence again with what Tiepolo's doing, but so much of what the story is about in a way is weight and gravity becomes so important because the cross itself, of course, determines Christ's actions, determines what happens to him, and then becomes symbolic. Of course, it's a loaded symbol, but the physicality of it and the weight of it was perfect for Kelly when dealing with this as a compositional device. And so the weight and measure of the way black and white work in his compositions and the distillation of those are really what tells the story, along with the line. I think so some of the correspondences and the ways you can read the text into his pieces are obvious, more obvious than others. I think that the carrying of the cross is a wonderful one because it's the idea of the weight just shifting slightly. So they're giving the cross to Christ, and instead of a vertical, this slight diagonal that Kelly uses in the second station here is like as if the weight is suddenly being shifted from vertical to this body. And then, of course, when he falls, it becomes a stronger diagonal, and so you get this telling of the story from one to the other in a really beautiful way, I think. So for example, in the fifth station in the middle here, Christ is relieved of the weight of the cross temporarily, and so for that you have a completely equal vertical horizontal of black and white, indicating that there's no weight being carried at that moment. It's a relief. It's less active. It's not dynamic. There's no diagonal. The Veronica's veil part of the Stations of the Cross often in traditional depictions of this, it is the cross is going vertically right across the composition from one corner to the other. So in that sense, and you don't see it in Tiepolo, but it's something you often see in these traditional depictions. So he's really taking up directly from the Christian tradition there. Then he's also talked about the relative amount of light and dark that you can see in these as reflective of elements of the story. Sometimes that's clear. I think when Christ falls for the second and third time, as you see on either end of these illustrations here, you can certainly read it as darkness becoming heavier, evil, whatever you want to read into it, the negative parts of the story, the oppressiveness of what he's going through becoming significant. And then, of course, once you get to the end, I think, is when things start to become most tied to the story, the crucifixion itself. And here in the middle, you don't actually have, in many depictions of the Stations of the cross is central and vertical in the middle. Of course, this is where the symbolism itself could become most strong in the limited vocabulary that Kelly chose. You'll notice that in this particular drawing, there's a thinner white line down the middle. He actually changed it to a much broader white line where you have a dark segment and white sections at either end. So, but it was still this idea of a strong tripartite vertical composition, and this is the only composition where it is actually tripartite, where it's divided into three, where there's not a single line dividing the composition into black or white. When Christ dies, he reverts to all black. I don't know if you can see it here, but this is noted as being all black, so you have to imagine that as a black square. So when you can reduce it down to the simplest visual vocabulary that makes sense, it makes perfect sense to do so. And then with the descent from the cross, you have just this vertical line indicating Christ's body coming down, and then with the entombment, here's an interesting example of the objectness of the representation kind of merging with the story, because if this had been actually made in white marble the way Kelly originally intended it, it would have been like the literal slab of a tomb. So you have this complete convergence of material and subject matter, which ends the story in a really beautiful way, but also the symbolism of the white becomes quite important. And I think you can compare this to other examples where artists like Rosso Fiorentino on the left and Caravaggio on the right, Fiorentino understanding the severe geometry of the cross itself and the importance of geometry in structuring his space, interesting play with positive and negatives, but also horizontality. And then, of course, with Caravaggio, you have this tomb slab jutting out at you in a very material way, which is something Kelly himself understood is important for the entombment. And then something like Donatello's depiction of the entombment, where you have actual marble representing the tomb of Christ, just the way it would have in Kelly's depiction of it. So despite lack of text, or at least there's no lack of text, but lack of realism and imagery of the real world, this beautiful distillation of the story in Kelly's mind. I think the last three depictions in the Stations of the Cross is among the most poignant, because here you have the death on the cross. So here these are from the mock-up of the chapel that Kelly himself made, and so you have this would be the death on the cross, the descent from the cross, and then the entombment. But they also represent, in a way, taken collectively, as a kind of transfiguration of Christ, because you have the dark earthly realm at the left, the Christ as the interlocutor between the earthly realm and the heavenly realm, and then the heavenly realm represented by white. And someone like Matthias Grunewald, his Resurrection of Christ is a painting that Kelly himself admired a great deal and studied when he first came to Europe, as one of the first things he went to see. And so many of these representations of the Transfiguration of Christ show a kind of distinct division between earthly and heavenly realms, with Christ being the kind of intermediary between the two. And I think you really see that in the last three panels of Kelly's Stations. Also, we can relate it very clearly to religious architecture in the 20th century. There are a number of precedents for the work. Of course, two famous examples of religious architecture are Le Corbusier's chapel at Ronchamp in the upper right, and then Matisse's chapel at Vence, which also includes stained glass and also includes a representation of the Stations of the Cross. And you would think that Kelly may have been directly inspired by this, but he actually says he wasn't, even though Matisse, and he's been directly compared to Matisse often, even in exhibitions. There was a plant drawing exhibition where it compared the two drawing styles. And of course, Kelly being a great colorist and Matisse being a great colorist, and both great handlers of light, you can understand the comparisons, but maybe it's too much for Kelly to accept that someone like to compare himself to Matisse because it's so close. But certainly there's interesting correspondences with Matisse's great chapel in Vence. His representations of the Stations of the Cross are these reductive examples of the story that are all presented on one wall in one visual plane, so they're actually very different from what Kelly did. The way this chapel relates to what Kelly did is the way they use light and the way they use stained glass, and of course stained glass has this very strong metaphorical sense in any kind of Christian context as this. What Matisse did was he made these also very reductive charcoal drawings, which I'll show you two examples, that became the basis for these enamel tiles where the designs were transferred. And then, of course, there's the Rothko Chapel in Houston, also done, interestingly enough, around the same time. It was from the early 1950s and then completed much later after actually Rothko's death. He never saw the paintings installed. And this is a non-denominational chapel, but it is called a chapel, so it has religious overtones. But I think something that's very different in a piece like this is these are all meant to be taken in at once, in a sense. You enter this space and you see everything at once. You sit in the middle and you can look at it. Kelly's is much more traditional in that it's diachronic. You walk around it and you experience in a time in a time unfolding fashion and also in a specific chronology, which is not the case for something like the Rothko Chapel. And then, of course, Dan Flavin, an artist who's well represented here in Munich. He did these interesting pieces early in his career, which he called icons, which, of course, use light in a symbolic way, especially if you take the title seriously. But, of course, the most famous example in the 20th century is Barnett Newman's Stations of the Cross, which were they were worked on in the early 1960s, and then they were shown together at the Guggenheim Museum in 1966. But these works were not meant to, they have no specific connection to the text of the Stations of the Cross. What Newman was trying to do was create a kind of holistic feeling with these works, and they're much more about painting. They relate very much to the aesthetic of abstract expressionism. You could see them in these photographs as having a kind of rigid geometry, but they're also very much about a kind of painterliness. And he described them as a holistic cry about sort of the state of the world. A lot of people have related them to the Holocaust and the events of World War II. And they also unfold, what they have in common with Kelly's is that they unfold diachronically. You see them in series. There is a specific order to them, and each one has a number, but Newman himself only gave them the title Stations of the Cross and saw them as an example of that after he started them. So they weren't conceived as that originally, so they're a bit different in that sense. And of course, Kelly, I'm sure when he decided to do this project, these works had to be in his mind, but his comes so much more specifically out of a very strong Christian tradition that's very interesting. And Newman's himself, I should say, were not meant to be seen in a religious context. In a way, they bring a religious context into a museum where they now currently are on permanent view in the National Gallery in Washington. They were first shown at the Guggenheim, and they were shown in the Guggenheim's signature galleries in the Rotunda, and they spilled into this other gallery. Just other examples of what they look like, so you can see how quite different they are. So much more about the materiality of paint. Kelly's would have been much more object-like. And just to provide some further context I thought it was interesting to find artists who've done stained glass more recently, such as Sigmar Polke. And then just to finish, the other thing I think that's important to note about the Stations of the Cross is their seriality, and the seriality that is important to Kelly throughout his career and to inspiring him. He's someone who, in a sense, his work is all one series. And this, I'm going to just go quickly through examples of drawings on a bus, because if you look at them quickly, it gives you a sense of sort of receiving a work one after the other where the view of one affects the view of the other, and I think that's much like the experience you'd have if his Stations of the Cross were to be built one day, which I hope it will be. I think I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions if you like. Thank you very much.
Now, yeah, thank you very much, Carter, for this very interesting lecture and interpretation and explanation to this non-existing piece. And well, maybe someday it becomes a real piece of art. As you said, meine Damen und Herren, wenn Sie Fragen haben, bitte schön, jetzt ist die Gelegenheit da. Maybe I start with one question. I mean, this deep interest of the artist in the Stations of the Cross at that time. So Newman, Kelly, I mean, artists who are, as you say, though Newman, on the other hand, was very deep in the Jewish mystic writings, and of course the Stations of the Cross are kind of symbolizing the very culminating point of the life of Christ, and really leads us to the mystery of Christian belief. So, and as you mentioned, and Kelly also mentioned that to me, that he is not religious at all. Why choosing this, maybe the most, one of the most complicated matters in Christian theology?
I think it's probably came from the commission itself, led him to the idea, because apparently this was going to be in Santa Barbara, but also it's sort of near Sonoma and Napa Valley, and apparently it's somewhat traditional in these vineyards there to have chapels. So it was sort of natural in a way for Doug Kramer to ask for a chapel on his vineyard. He was sort of doing what was normal for the area. And at first, he did not design Stations of the Cross. He just did the stained glass without the paintings or the objects, whatever they were going to be. But I think then he just felt it looked too empty, and it just made sense. I think because he's not religious, but he's someone who would go to churches a lot. So he knew that this tradition existed, and he just saw it as eminently adaptable to this commission. So I think if someone hadn't asked him to build a chapel, he probably wouldn't have thought of the Stations of the Cross. But in the context, and because of his own knowledge of religious art and architecture, which did deeply influence him, especially as a young man, it just made perfect sense. This is something be interesting to ask him. I'd like to know when he hit on the idea that the cross itself as the protagonist really would just work so beautifully as in this series, and that's something I've never asked him, and I don't know.
So it's more the formal aspects that were interesting.
I think the formal, but I think he saw it as he just saw it as appropriate, and he saw that in the distribution of the space, it was the perfect way to activate the space, and it was appropriate for a chapel. And even though, because I think maybe perhaps once he decided to put this wooden totem at the end of the space, then it becomes more like a traditional chapel, and then sort of what else are you going to do? But I do think it was a stroke of genius, but I think it's also just it represents his engagement with art history as much as anything. Which, like many people who study art history, if you're not, whether you're Christian or not, you often know more about Christianity than people who are Christian, because it's so important in art history, and he's just deeply engaged in art history, and I think it's a reflection of that as much as anything. Any questions?
Any questions? So maybe one more. Did he ever, I never asked him that, did he mention it to you, whether he had at a certain point, I mean that's now more than 25 years in the past that he created this. Did he ever think about doing it as paintings? I mean, not in terms of the chapel project, but as a series like
there are some
Newman did
recent paintings in the show and that reflect some of his recent explorations of this idea of a diagonal, which some of them which led into color variations. But I think you can see that in the show there what some of the works might have looked like had they ever been executed. But I somehow don't think he would consider doing it without the chapel, because it maybe wouldn't make sense. But I don't know. You never know with him.
I think it would be interesting to see how he would deal with it.
I wonder if it might become too much. I think what sets this apart partly is from Barnett Newman is that, and it's hard to avoid the comparison with Newman because they're so, in a way, it's reductive. They're both in black and white. And Newman's, of course, is such a famous example that. But if they're in a chapel, it kind of creates a completely different context for them. So who knows? Let's hope he does them. Let's hope someone commissions the chapel. I'd love to see it.
Maybe the exhibition helps.
Carter, could you place this chapel within the context of the exhibition? Because it's very striking to see the totem at the very end of the chapel. And here, I don't know what Ulrich was thinking in installing the work in the main room. It has the same kind of, verticality that maybe sort of divides the space.
Well,
do you see any kind of relationship?
It seems to me that this exhibition, I mean, and I know that Kelly was involved with the installation, I'm sure, but the architecture here is so striking and so perfect for the art that it's such a wonderful melding of the objects and the architecture, and that's what this chapel would have been, a wonderful melding too. So it seems. But I guess what's interesting too is that the obvious difference is that this chapel would have been suffused with colored light, which would have given it a totally different. It's hard to. That's something that can't come across in the photographs because none of them would show how the daylight would actually come in and sit on these surfaces and also change the way that you would see the painting. So they'd be quite different in that sense. What I love about the show is just the distillation that happens, and I think that the absence of color makes, in a way, a more kind of meditative experience, perhaps. I don't know, and maybe you get some sense of that in this exhibition. I certainly think so. Because if you imagine this was a Kelly show that was not that was just more of a retrospective and had all color, it would just look so totally different than just the black and white. And I think it's actually very brave to do a Kelly black and white show because it's not easy necessarily for everyone. And it's, anyway.
I don't know if, of course I worked a lot on it, but the more I look at it, I think sometimes I've got the feeling that the show is even a little bit didactic in terms of the practice that Ellsworth is doing over 60 years. So from my understanding, it's probably much easier to understand Kelly's art and Kelly's intentions by looking at the black and white ones only. And because you can always think about the colors as being the emotional addition to his ideas about form and how he is distilling these forms from reality. So from my point of view, it's much easier to understand.
Yeah, and I think distillation that's one of the main things of his art is about distillation, and this is like a distilled version of his distillation, so it's very... Also, I think what's important and what people often don't realize, especially in this day and age when everything gets fabricated so readily a part of a lot of work, Kelly's sculpture and things like that get fabricated, but and of course he has the panels stretched, but he paints everything himself still at 88 years old. And he's so particular about how everything, there's really like a handmade aspect to his work that's, I think people don't really realize. And that's why you can look very closely, you can never look closely enough at his work because it's so much about nuance, which is very much put there by hand and not by machine or by anything like that.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Any more questions? Yes, finally.
I have a question on the technical thing on the stone, really stone panels.
Right.
Were they considered to be adjoined panels or like more reliefs? What?
More release. They as I understand it, they would have been joined so that the marble and the
It's like a plane.
would have been a single plane.
Okay.
But of course, he has this idea of relief is very important in these joined panels. So I think that if it came down to actually executing the piece, he probably would have rethought a lot of it based on how the materials reacted, because it would have been necessary. But as he explained it to me originally, it was on a single plane with these, this marble and this slate material being the color carriers and also creating the line. So there would have been a very specific line between them, but they would have been joined very carefully.
And would it have been the first stone work, or did he execute many works in stone? Because I was flipping through catalogs and I didn't really find anything.
I can't think of I don't think he's done anything in stone. Usually his sculptures are some kind of painted metal or not painted metal, but they're usually metal or wood. I think no. I don't know that he ever has done stone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, meine Damen und Herren, für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Und once again, thanks, Carter, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.